Hi guys, hey everyone. Shram, I think you've had a name change there. Good to see you. Git, hi from Sweden. Pauline Buckles, good to see you. Sharon, I'm glad that you're here. Vicky Cunningham, 8 p.m. on Sunday in South Africa. Yeah, that is correct. I really would have liked to have done more research, and I have. I have done quite a lot of research, but there was something I really wanted to dive into. I tried to cram some information from Ernest Becker. I might need to do that on a different time in the sort of detail that I want to do it. It's quite weird. When I first came onto this case, I thought, how much is there to say? And I'm sitting here this evening thinking, there's so much to say, kind of thing. It's quite weird. Here is Timmy. He's had quite a good day. We had a barbecue today, and he's definitely, I think he's had a really good holiday and a really good rest. Haven't you, Timmy? Right? Timmy? Connie, good to see you. Merrily Hughes from Reno, Nevada. Marlene Stewart, good to see you. King Farouk. Okay, so we're going to be talking about the MOAb incident today. I'm going to be taking you guys through the official police report. I'll probably be following this up next week by going step by step through what we see in the body cam with Gabby. A lot of people seem to still be misspelling her name, especially with the hashtags. It's quite easy to remember. Think about the word petite and then just turn it into Petito kind of thing. But there are quite a few people that are kind of still misspelling the hashtags. It's quite sort of annoying because it's like, just get her name right for starters. So we're going to be doing that. I'm going to be touching a little bit on the analysis of certain other experts and other people, of taking it further, but also looking at some of the important things that I think that they've noticed. I'll put a link into what I think is a really good analysis on the MOAb incident in the description. Someone said that they felt it was very opinionated and very biased against Brian, but I think with the benefit of hindsight, I think one can see why one would take that position. I'm also going to be talking a little bit about the Summer Wells case, and I probably should start off with that just by saying that we passed the 3-month anniversary, and I think it's clear that this case has taken place within the same timeline as the Summer Wells case. And what I mean is this case was actually in process. It was sort of moving forward. It was progressing at the same time that the Summer Wells case was happening. So if you consider that Gabby and Brian arrived in New York June 17th, and Summer Wells disappeared June 15th, right? And everything that's gone on there. Bear in mind, the Summer Wells case was probably the most high-profile case prior to this one. And so what are the chances that Brian didn't hear some of that coverage? And you might think that in terms of the Summer Wells case, you might think, well, the strategy of law enforcement is a good one, to hold back, to wait and see, to be patient, which is the same strategy in the Laurie Vallow case, same strategy in the Barry Morphew case. But from the perspective of someone who's a would-be perpetrator, is it such a good strategy? Isn't it tempting someone into committing a crime, this perception that didn't someone get away with something? Isn't it so easy to get away with something? So easy to make someone disappear? So easy not to be held accountable? And so I think in that aspect, that intertextuality is quite worrying, I think, and something perhaps for law enforcement to think about. Angie Erickson, thanks a lot for that. Thank you. Let's just acknowledge some of the folks in chat. Jean, good to see you here. Vicky worry that Summer will be put to the sideshow now. Nothing new, and the Gabby case is taking up all the headlines. At the moment, nothing much is happening in the Summer Wells case. That may change, but certainly at the moment, not much is happening. There were a couple of things I wanted to do on the Summer Wells case, but I felt like I wanted to do it as an interactive thing, so I might do it in the middle of the week next week. Shireen says the lawyer for Brian's family is failing them and they are not listening to legal advice. They need to make a public statement now. Sweet Carolina says hello to all of you great people. Amy's, I think, hello from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Timmy had a blast sharpening his saw. So something that I may touch on the other side of the MOAb incident is the trip that I've just come back from. I've just been on around about a 10-day trip to the coast and back. And although overall it was probably quite a good experience, and I've come back, exercised and refreshed to some extent, there were some pretty horrible things that happened that I haven't actually told any of you about, including something that happened right in the beginning. And what do you think is probably not the worst possible thing that can happen to you prior to going on a trip, but in the top three? Think about that just for a moment, and then I'll take you to that kind of at the end of the analysis. What's one of the worst ways to start a trip in a car? The rabbit hole goes deep says, love your critical thinking on all cases. Love you and your content. Sharon Tuck says, car trouble. You could say that. You could say that. Connie's got it right, flat tire. So before I even left home, when I sort of, on the day that I was going to leave, I walked past my vehicle and the rear right tire was completely flat. Not the nicest way to start a trip. And in fact, my neighbor, when she saw that, basically said, so I guess you're not leaving, or something like that. I guess you're not going to leave today. So so that definitely was kind of stressful. So I'll talk to you guys a little bit about that, but part of what you've got to do in that situation is mood management. I was irritated, I was frustrated, I was quite angry. And of course, if you're with someone, what do you like to be with in a situation like that? Travel is one of the ways that you find out who you are, but it's also a way that someone else finds out who you are, and you find out what is it like to be with a particular person in different situations. How flexible are you? How socialized are you? How do you deal with problems? Can you let things go? Are you a moaner? Are you positive? Do you have a good sense of humor? Are you patient? All of those things. It's kind of like lockdown. Yeah. So, when I took Timmy along, and someone asked, where is he? Here he is lying in my arm. It's also that, I get to know Timmy a little bit better, and I guess Timmy got to know me a little bit better as well. Driving with a dog somewhere for hours on end is also a different situation. Something I didn't know is, what does the law say about that? Are you allowed to have a dog on the front seat? What is the legal of having a dog with you? So we'll talk about that in a little while. But let's start with the MOAb incident. I see we've got 400 people in chat. SM Kovalinsky says Timmy was a great companion. He was a great companion at the beach, although I did lose him once at the beach, which is pretty unexpected. Travel is a great exposer. Yeah. Doris White says, hi, all from Scotland. Okay, so I'm going to get going. We're going to go through the police report of the MOAb incident. Let's just get a sense, how many of you guys have personally read the MOAb incident report from the beginning to the end? If you have, put a 1. If you haven't, put a 2. Let's just get a sense of how well you guys know it. Crystalina Bacteria says, I've had 2 flat tires and my daughter was with me. I stayed calm. Oh, well, that's good. So what did I say? 1 if you've read it, 2 if you haven't. Is that what I said? But I see a lot of 1s and 2s. So I'd say most of you have read it. Okay. Watched the body cam but didn't read the report. Okay. Okay, so for those of you who have read the report, I hope I'm going to be able to provide you with some insight and certain things that perhaps you didn't see in the first thing. So the first thing I think to mention is, although the report is dated the 13th of August, which is actually Friday the 13th, it actually happened the day before, so the 12th, a Thursday. It is authored by, I think, Eric Pratt. It refers to a Ford Transit van, white, QFT G03 Florida license plates. Refers to Gabrielle Venora Petito, that's her middle name, and Brian Christopher Laundrie. And then there's also another name, Christopher. I'm not quite sure why that's redacted out there. There's also, I think, Daniel Scott and someone called Robbins. And it refers to, it happened between 4:30 in the afternoon and 6:04 in the afternoon. And it is sort of officially kind of listed as disorderly conduct. Now, I've got to tell you, I've been in a situation where, I was actually taken off the road once where I didn't have I had the right name on my license plates, but the license plate type had changed. So I actually needed to change them. And the police dude told me I must rip my license plate off my vehicle because I'm not driving with the right ones. And so I said, no, I'm not going to. I'll replace them, but I'm not going to take them off immediately. And then he wanted me to go to the police station. And so I did. And in the end, I was let go. And it was, but what I find quite interesting with a situation like that is, often the police, when they write a narrative, and that's exactly what this is, when they write the story of what has happened, it's not the best narrative that you've ever read. Details are sometimes lacking. And so the police actually need to be good storytellers, and that's not something that's very, very likely, right? When I say good storytellers, I mean someone who can pay attention to details, someone that can give the proper context, someone that can show things in the right perspective. And it's not easy. It's not easy getting the information and then telling a good story. When I say good story, I don't mean interesting, but I mean something that is factual, true, legally actionable, and picks up all the details in a way that is realistic and authentic, right? And it's quite difficult to balance all of that in a narrative. It's so easy to leave something out. Okay, so let's go to the narrative. On the 12th of August 2021, and this date right now may not seem that relevant, but it is at a certain point in the pandemic, right? That's quite important. The timing of this in terms of the broader timing of the pandemic. I know when the pandemic started happening, because I've got a true crime channel, I just sort of wondered generally, what impact is the coronavirus going to have on true crime, right? So anyway, MCPD officers were dispatched to a report of a domestic problem that had taken place near the Moonflower Co-op. It appeared that a male and female had left the scene traveling north on Main in a white Ford Transit van with a black ladder on the rear after the male and female had engaged in some sort of altercation. It wasn't clear, but I believe it was reported the male had been observed to have assaulted the female. I heard other officers report they were off to look for the vehicle, and being that I had to pass the Moonflower in order to get to Main Street, I stopped there to see if any witnesses were still in the area. I found, and I'm going to come back to some of this, but I just want to finish the opening paragraph. He says, I found one witness, identified as Chris, that's the witness, and then that part is redacted. I took down his phone number and left the scene because I heard Officer D. Robbins tell dispatch he'd located the suspect vehicle near the turn to Arches National Park. I heard him state that upon initiating a traffic stop, he'd observed the vehicle leave its lane and strike the curb before stopping near the entrance to the park. So just that is quite an unusual scenario. So someone called Chris actually saw an altercation, I think, inside the vehicle. And even this isn't completely clear. It appeared that a male and female were traveling north, and even this part's not immediately clear. That was there altercation inside the vehicle or outside? Now, the way I understand it was that there was an argument over the phone inside the vehicle that someone saw, and someone actually also saw Brian striking Gabby. That's how I understood it. Someone says, please don't criticize this guy. Okay. Let's just look at your comments. So let me just ask you guys, do you guys understand that the same way? That this started by some eyewitness saw someone in a white van, and the male in the van struck the female in the van, and they were arguing over a phone. Is that how you guys understood it? Vicky says, I felt like the police were kind of trying to control the narrative. It does seem that way. Let's just look at Mary Rose says no. Okay. You can be 2 days off and still have an episode. Rebecca says, are we just going over old news? So, Rebecca, I don't know whether you're new to this channel. What I am doing is I'm reviewing the MOAb incident, but I'm going to try and see things that perhaps others haven't and interpret things in a different way. If you don't know me, you might not be interested in that. If you do, you'll probably know that there'll probably be some interesting insights taken out of that. So I hope that answers your question. I do think it is quite interesting that the scene of the crime, if you want to call it that, and where they got hold of the couple was somewhere else. And I don't know if you guys remember the guy on the body cam can be heard saying it wasn't that easy to catch up to you. It was actually quite difficult to get to you. And I thought that was something that that was dropped fairly quickly, almost as though the drama overtook that aspect. Someone says there's 2 sets of flip-flops outside the van. Pauline says, I understood it to be outside the grocery store initially. Okay. I doubt seriously he's in the park in Florida. So, yeah, I do kind of want to try and focus our attention. Thanks a lot, Heather West. I do want to try and focus our attention to this incident. I know a lot of you guys want to talk about other things, but, the question that I'm asking is this scene where the guy said he observed the male to have assaulted the female. And he says here, it wasn't clear, but I believe it was reported the male had been observed to have assaulted the female. And then he describes the vehicle. So the way I understand it, there may have been two incidents or two places, outside the grocery store and then also inside the vehicle, right? I do think it's quite a big thing where someone is arguing in such a extreme way, in such an expressive way, in such a flagrant, extravagant way that actually leads someone to call the police, right? It's not that the police notice someone, a civilian notices someone and they are so concerned that they call the police. And you might say, you know what, whoever did that was completely, that was total overreaction, it was totally unnecessary. Well, not from the perspective where we are right now. So whoever called the police took, I think, appropriate action. And I think the question comes up, were there other incidents? Were there other screaming matches that the public observed prior to August 12th? I'm talking about on this trip. I don't really mean within the couple's history. I think that's a different argument, right? I also think that if someone called the police when they were arguing within the vehicle, that is, you've got to see quite clearly an extended argument that's just not stopping. And it just seems to be something that is quite serious. And let's face it, it was quite serious because he had scratches just under his eye and she was in tears and she was distressed. And they had been arguing all morning. Bear in mind, this was at the end of the day. So if they'd been arguing all morning, and this happened at about 4 o'clock that afternoon, then they'd basically been arguing that whole day, probably about the blog, right? So, like just in terms of this, the officer acknowledges it wasn't clear. And a thing like that kind of needs to be sorted out in the narrative. It wasn't clear, well, to me, well, give us some more information. Nothing here, like in the first paragraph, raises all these questions about, so where did this happen? What exactly did happen? What did this person observe? So he gives some of the details that do matter. Bear in mind, the police deal with a lot of incidents. Some of them go nowhere. Some of them are not very serious. So, it's a bit unfair to have that high standard applied to the police, just saying you need to remember every single detail, colors, temperatures, tempers, words that were said. Remember it all when there are quite a lot of things that happen that are of no consequence. So that's the other side of it. I guess the best that they can do is the best that they can do. Try and be as diligent as you can, based on what is going on. So he says, he found this witness. I took down his phone number and left the scene because I heard Officer D. Robbins tell dispatch he'd located the suspect vehicle near the turn to Arches National Park. I heard him state that upon initiating a traffic stop, he'd observed the vehicle leave its lane and strike the curb. So that vehicle had to be kind of stopped. You didn't really get the sense that the lights went on and the car slowed down. I mean, we all know this, but you kind of got the sense that Brian was fleeing the scene, which is dumb. I mean, you're just going to make things 10 times worse. And so they apprehended him, and he dealt with it. But isn't that being repeated right now again? Isn't that being repeated again? Brian fleeing the scene, right? I wonder, has he fled in a car or anything like that? Okay, so he observed the vehicle leave its lane and strike the curb before stopping near the entrance to the park. Now, something that I'm going to just be quite kind of obvious about. When when you watch the body cam and the body cam sort of starts, the officer actually exclaims something like, "Whoa!" The car's veered, I guess, to the right, and it struck the curb, and he seems to get quite a shock. He visibly and audibly is quite stunned by that, right? Now, the thing that I found weak and not good enough was, like, so that was something he observed firsthand, and then when he confronted Gabby and Brian, I didn't really get a sense that he clarified, that he got clarity on why that sudden swerving to the curb took place. I don't get the sense that that was established with any degree of certainty. So let me ask you a question, and let's get a sense from you guys. How many of you think that the swerve was caused by Gabby, meaning I don't think she touched the steering wheel, but because of her, what do you call it? Because of her interfering with Brian. I don't think she wanted Brian to be driving the way that he was. She caused him to do that, or that Brian just turned into the curb. So one, that Gabby caused it, and two, that Brian did. Let's see what you guys say. Sweet Carolina says yes, look at his arm. Ruth says yes, to get him to stop. He was 30 over the limit. Yeah. So you kind of get the sense that, so even here, there are quite a few people saying one, quite a few saying two. Can you see how on these basic questions, it's people aren't quite sure what's going on? And that is something where the police kind of just have to get certainty. And you've got the people there, get an answer. In a sense, it's not a black-white answer, because the one person's driving and the other person wants a different outcome. And so you can't say it's completely the one or the other, right? But I do think even in that first impression that the police got of Gabby and Brian, there's a different approach from both of them. His approach is to leave in her vehicle, and her approach is to slow down and stop and deal with the situation, right? I think the other thing that you could consider is Brian may have thought, Brian actually said, when he was asked what happened there, he said something like, well, the adrenaline kicked in and the next thing I knew I was going 45, right? Do you believe that? Like, do you accept that explanation? Now, on paper, it's not very acceptable, but when you see his demeanor, and he seems very open and unthreatening and apologetic, then you think, well, I guess it's no big deal. But on paper, it's not really going to pass the smell test. So the other side of it is, it's not his vehicle. So if he drives away from the scene and they take down the license plate or whatever, he's not necessarily going to get into trouble, because they're going to track the vehicle to her, not to him. So in a weird way, there's already perhaps a little bit of thinking about consequences, or not thinking about consequences, just something to think about. Also, he doesn't have his phone with him, apparently. I don't know what you guys think about that. I mean, if he's got his charger there and the charger comes up, did he have his phone with him or not? I don't know what you guys think about that. I've heard some people, Brianna says, hi, I'm a new subscriber. Good to see you here, Brianna. Holographic Cat says he has a phone that he doesn't use, okay. Vicky says, why try evade the cops if you are innocent? Blue-eyed Scorpio says, yes, he needed a charger. So when I was on my little trip with Timmy, I actually got pulled over by the police. And it was quite weird. I was driving, I think I'd just gone over a bridge, and there were a couple of vehicles, and they kind of pointed me out and they pulled me over. And to be honest, I sort of had the feeling of, I haven't done anything wrong, I think, but I didn't really want to stop, but I did stop. And then ironically, the next day, I was in a queue of about 4 or 5 vehicles, all moving at normal sort of speed. And the vehicles, I think 3 or 4 vehicles in front of me got pulled over, and then I was allowed to continue. And I thought, wow, that's justice, if they pulled me over again, kind of thing. And so I know that feeling, but it's totally different where you have done something wrong. And so the question I want to put to you guys is, someone asked, are we going over old stuff? I'm trying to provide a bit of a practical, think about this, where you're practically on the road. How would you feel about it? Is this normal? Now, I think one of the things that's a possibility is that Brian may have been conscious of what had been going on that day, and didn't want to, he may have felt like, I'm in trouble for what I've done already, regardless of speeding or anything else. He may have felt, wow, I'm in trouble for what I've already done, right? I did have a little bit of a sense of when I was pulled over that I might be in trouble having a dog on the front seat. And I spoke to someone at a barbecue today, and I said, do you know what the law says about that? Because to be honest, I don't. And someone said they were actually pulled over by the police. I think she had her dog on her lap while she was driving. And everybody knows that you shouldn't be doing that. And I think they said the dog needs to be in the back seat in a cage or something like that. I just wonder how something like that is enforced. If you don't have a cage with you and you far from home, what are the police going to do? Take your dog? So in South Africa, there are a lot of people with dogs. So who knows? But nevertheless, I think part of that feeling of, oh no, was, I don't think I've done anything wrong, but I could be in trouble here. And probably Brian felt the same thing, but perhaps he was more conscious that he had done something wrong. Connie says, we have never put our dog in a cage in the car. They make doggy seatbelts. Do they? I've never heard of that. But you certainly can't put a seatbelt on a dog in a car. That's definitely not going to happen. But I can imagine you can get a dog seat just like you get a car seat. Maybe that's something for inventors, people, young kids who don't have anything to do or looking for a new career. Maybe that's something you can do, is pet seatbelts in vehicles, even on back of mountain bikes or something like that. Rebecca said, I'm more scared in America being pulled over by police. Okay, I see what you're saying. Doggy seatbelts. Okay, someone says it's a harness. But the point I'm trying to get to is, did Brian have a reason that he didn't want to stop? And I think he did. I think the fact that he didn't stop willingly shows kind of a cowardice. And you might not like that word. You might say you're criticizing him, but what else is it? What else is it where the police want you to stop and you have done something and you're not stopping? What else can one call that, right? Someone says the best place for dogs is the floor. Well, I don't know if the dogs feel that way. So in any event, Brian may have been, bear in mind, right next to Brian is Gabby, and she's in tears, and he's got a fresh sort of injury on. It's not a good look. And so Brian doesn't want to have this, he doesn't want to communicate with the police. He doesn't want this situation. And so he's trying to escape it. And then what happens? He can't escape it, but he manages to deal with it fairly well. I mean, I think you could have had a situation with different police that may have handled it differently. I mean, I think an interesting question to ask is, what would have happened if there was a female officer in charge? Do you think there would have been a different outcome if there was a female officer in charge? And would Gabby perhaps have spoken to a female officer in a more, I don't want to say honest way, but in a more heartfelt way, in a more complete way than the officer that she spoke to? Sharon says TCRS is the best subs. Only because of intuition on emotions. Catherine Mooney says, too bad Gabby didn't get the hell out of there that day and go with the cops. And I think that's quite a good question, is why didn't she? Why, things weren't going so well then. Why didn't she just go home? It's like, isn't this a sign that this is the end? And I think that's a very important question to ask seriously and also to answer seriously. So to ask seriously, okay, something serious has happened. Another thing that I found a little bit odd, I don't know if you guys did, was this idea of this couple are actually physically taking one another on, and they're a young couple. Max, thanks a lot, Max, telling Brian had so much to say at the traffic stop, but has stayed quiet now. Yeah, that is quite a good point. Those mismatches are always a sign of something. But anyway, I think to come back to the original question, why wouldn't Gabby have felt free to just call it quits, call it a day, and go home? Well, I think there are a couple of possibilities. One is that she may have felt that her little blog is getting traction. She may have felt that although maybe it hadn't gotten to a spectacular start, it had gotten to a start and it was starting, the ball was starting to get rolling. She was trying to believe in herself. That seemed to be the main thing that they disagreed on, that she was trying to believe in herself and he just didn't, especially in terms of this project that they were on. And she may also have felt that she needed him for it to work. She needed perhaps him as a mechanic, as a protector, as a navigator. Perhaps he had money that he could contribute. Perhaps he contributed to the editing and the design of some of the things. You may not think that there's editing or design in the Instagram posts or whatever, but I think there is quite a lot. You can see in the way that the van has been cleaned out and tidied up. The content is also quite tidy. The YouTube video, quite a lot of work went into it. My only criticism of their content is that they weren't putting out nearly enough. They needed far more content. And, given that they were out there already a month and a half, you need to build a following, and to build a following, you need regular content, and they weren't prolific enough. And, but another part of it was they needed to continue making content, which meant the trip needed to go on. So Gabby it could have been a situation that Gabby was using Brian, but also that she felt that they were partners, right? But Brian may not have felt the same way. He may have felt like, well, I don't believe in this. I don't like what's happening to Gabby. I don't like the attention she's getting. I don't like where this is going, and I don't like how I'm exposed. I don't, it's like Chris Watts and Shanann. Chris Watts didn't want to be part of the Thrive spiels. Well, Brian probably didn't want to be part of things in a similar way. Maybe he wanted to be in the beginning. Maybe he wanted to be, I want to make this about me and you on our trip, and maybe insisted on that. But then later on, there may have been snide comments talking about are you with that guy? Why are you with that guy? Kind of thing. That can really be a real thing. That can definitely be a real thing. Jean Borman says 35-year marriage, that's not perfect, is codependent, is not unusual. Whisper softly says he even looks like Chris Watts, acted the same. Al Boyd says he was a loner, looked much older than 23. I thought he looked older than 23. She was attractive, vivacious, and that was the dynamic. Catherine Mooney says she was too good for him. Well, I think you've got to look at why she chose to be with him and even initially agreed to marry him. I mean, she put up something on Instagram where she said that she was quite excited about it. So that's the other side. And bear in mind, she was quite anxious. We're going to talk about that in a moment. She was quite anxious. And I think to some extent, I think he soothed that anxiety by being overprotective and by being her companion. But then I think he certainly, there was the other side of that as well, where he actually caused the anxiety. And, somewhere in the body cam, she says, he's a downer, he's been criticizing me, he's been, that they'd argued about the blog that whole day, that whole morning. And so, he becomes someone who can protect her from anxiety, and that's one thing, but then he can also be the source of anxiety, which is a totally different thing altogether. Okay, so let's go back to the MOAb incident. And he arrives on the scene and he observed as 2 park officers also arrived. So there were quite a few people there. That's another question to ask, besides if there was a female officer, what would have happened if there was just 1 officer or 2 officers? Would there, because you kind of get a sense that kind of garbled communication going on. This one talks and that one talks and that one talks. Whereas if it was one person getting the story, you would get kind of a more, there would be more continuity potentially. If you think about a police officer in the same way you think about a reporter, think about a police officer arrives on the scene. They've got the authority to say, get out your vehicle, put your keys on the vehicle, get out the vehicle, I'm going to separate you. And that was a good thing that they did. But I think what they could have done earlier on, they could have had just a moment where both of them are in the vehicle at the same time and just said, okay, what is happening here? Why did you swerve? And then have the one say what happened in front of the other one, right? And then separate them and then get that thing. You could also have almost a situation where you get them together, making a little short statement, then separate them, get the statements, and then bring them together again, and then review those statements a little bit without causing an argument. I'm just saying potentially that's something to do. But the main difference between a reporter doing this and a policeman and a reporter is a policeman is going to write down a few little notes like the time and just like keywords, and is going to be quite intimidating, and you're probably going to have someone saying things that sound appropriate in a way, right? And they're quite an intimidating presence. And then compare that to a reporter who would scribble down a lot more notes, and the reporter would be less intimidating, but probably would get a lot more information because the reporter is trying to be approachable, not trying to tell someone what to do. And when you're giving orders and asking questions, you tend to get short answers. Whereas when you're having a conversation, as reporters try and do, that's how you get the information, right? So I think just think about it that way. So he goes on to say, I assisted Officer Robbins with his investigation until I was called away to a report of an intoxicated male near MRH, posing a safety risk to himself or others. Before leaving, I spoke with the male driver of the van, the female passenger, and also called Chris to get more information from him. So yeah, you've got another aspect that is pulling on the string of what actually happened during the MOAb incident. You've got another incident taking place that's drawing this officer's attention away from it, right? What is good is that at least he spoke to 3 pertinent individuals: Gabby, Brian, and the witness, the person who reported it. Anyway, so let's just go through this. All 3 individuals gave me a similar and consistent story, consisting of the basic idea that the driver of the van, a male, had some sort of argument with a female, Gabby, as I recall. He spells Gabby wrong, well, not with a Y. You might not think that's a big detail, but it's giving a sense of, did you actually ask the person how to spell their name? Because if you're going to write the report, did you do that? The other thing that I think is good about the statement here is where he says the stories were similar, the stories were consistent, and the basic idea is that the male had some sort of argument with the female. So in that basic fabric, it's saying that the male was kind of the perpetrator. The male did something. I could be wrong, but when I look at the body cam footage, I sort of get the story that the male felt that the female was arguing with him, that the female was emotional, that the female needed to be calmed down, that he was kind of the victim, that she was the perpetrator, that she was over emotional. And so that is already in conflict with the basic story from this police narrative. That makes sense, right? So I'm just saying from the body cam, when you are getting it from Brian, you feel like that he felt that he was kind of being victimized and that he needed to distance himself, kind of thing, right? And that contradicts what is said here. So to go on, the basic idea that the driver of the van, a male, had some sort of argument with a female, Gabby, as I recall. The male tried to create distance by telling Gabby to go take a walk to calm down. So if you take this literally, again, I'm a little bit confused. I don't really know whether what's happening now is the argument now the argument in the vehicle, or is the argument referring to another argument where we try to create a distance? It's just, to me, a little bit murky and muddy and mixed up, right? But the other side of it is telling her to go for a walk. Is that going to calm her down? I don't know. What else is there? Giving her a hug, saying, "Look, I'm not quite sure what you're doing with your blog, but I'll support you." Telling her to take a walk to calm down. Now, bear in mind where we are today. We're talking about this in hindsight. Well, he has now taken a walk. That's now how he has solved the current impasse with the law pursuing him, right? He's left, right? Is that going to solve the problem? And one wonders, did he get this idea of taking a walk from home? Is that what his parents would do? I know when I grew up, my parents would say, if things kind of got out of hand, even if I was a teenager, go to your room. And sometimes I would go to my room and then stay in it because I would become preoccupied with what I was doing there. And then they would actually say, come out of your room, kind of thing. But I just mean, when I've had to discipline my dog, I don't feel like there's a terrible amount that you can do. There's positive reinforcement, but one of the things I would do is put him in a room. I've had a cat here, and they just wouldn't stop chasing one another, and a lot of the time fun, but how do you impose discipline in a kind of a harmless way? Well, one of the ways to quieten someone down, go to your room. But that's something that I learned from how I was disciplined. One just wonders whether that is something, because Brian's still living at home, was he imposing a kind of parental discipline, which is totally different to when you're in a relationship with a woman. It's different. It can feel condescending, and that's certainly a word that Dr. John Matthias mentioned that I thought was quite appropriate. It's kind of contempt and condescending, and the one is in a position of power, but including physical power, and then the other one must just do as they're told. It's not really a constructive way of dealing with a disagreement. So let's just go through this. They had some sort of argument. I don't really like that. I think that should be clarified. What is the argument about? Be specific. As far as we know, it was possibly about the little blog that she was trying to do. And that was the first thing one of the first things she mentioned was that Brian didn't believe in her. And she was clearly distressed about that. And that was what the whole trip was about. So if he didn't believe in her, what is the point on going on the trip, kind of thing. So the male tried to create distance. Now, think about those words and what actually happened with Brian, where Brian actually left wherever they were together and drove back to Florida alone in the van. And hasn't he created distance, physical distance between himself and Gabby? So his way of dealing with conflict, create distance. And if a crime has been committed, didn't someone also create distance as well? So anyway, she told Gabby to take a walk to calm down, but she didn't want to be separated from him. And so I think you've got to think about what's going on there is where he's saying, take a walk, but she doesn't want to be separated, partly because he's got the keys and it's her home. So it's kind of like he's telling her something that is going to make her more anxious, going to make her feel more dependent, which is just not fair. It's like, I'm offering you a solution which is actually problematic, right? And doesn't he know that? Doesn't he know that that's happening? The male tried to create distance by telling Gabby to go take a walk to calm down. She didn't want to be separated from the male and began slapping him. So I think that's also quite important to say. She's not slapping him because his feet smell or because he said a bad word. I kind of get the feeling she's slapping him because what's going on is a kind of coercion, that she's being told to do something that is actually making her more anxious, and she doesn't want him to do that. She's by slapping him, she's kind of saying, stop hurting me, stop hurting our relationship, stop dealing with this in a way that is harmful. She doesn't need to take a walk. She can just be there and do something else. She doesn't need to be physical distance, right? The other side of it is he can take a walk. It's her van. He can give her the keys, give her a sense that she's in control, and he can take a walk and say, look, I think you need to calm down. Maybe you want to play the Taylor Swift song while you're doing it. I'm going to take a walk, or I'm going to go to the store, or I'm going to make something. And yeah, your keys, and so you don't have to worry about that. But by not doing that, I think he's actually trying to worry her purposefully. It's kind of a threat, isn't it? It's a veiled threat. And I do think you can reach a point in a relationship, especially with young people, where you feel like you can't negotiate, so you threaten. You can't resolve things in a certain way, so you set ultimatums, right? And there's so much I can tell you about a trip I did when I was overseas, and I felt like I was in the same position, where, I didn't want to be alone, and I don't think she wanted to be alone, but we were arguing as well. And you're trying to get certainty that the person you're with is going to stay with you, but it's like what they say and what is actually happening are totally different. And there's quite a lot I can tell you about that, and this case definitely reminds me of that. There's quite a lot I can tell you about that, but it comes down to maturity and your ability to deal with anxiety. And I've written something down here. Was Brian suffering from a failure to launch? It was Brian, the fact that he was living at home, was he kind of a failure to launch? Was Gabby, right? Something that Ernest Becker wrote is that character is the restrictive shaping of possibility. So character is kind of like how you define yourself, but it can also be the restrictive shaping of possibility. And sometimes a relationship has a character as well. Sometimes a relationship has its own personality. And sometimes part of that personality is restrictive. It's about control. You may know certain relationships that are very free, very come and go, very open, very relaxed, and others that are not, where you've got to time in, you've got to check in, you've got to clear things with the other person, and they may work. That restrictive scenario works, and this open scenario works, and you've got to find out what works for you. But the feeling I get is that the character that Brian wanted for this relationship was a lot more restrictive than what Gabby wanted. And what comes across over and over again is that she's a free spirit. You get the sense that he's free-spirited but controlling. She's free-spirited and anxious, whereas he's free-spirited and jealous. That's kind of the sense that one gets. And so going on this trip, I kind of get the sense that Gabby came out of it encouraged and optimistic to some extent. This is aside from Brian's influence. And Brian came out of it kind of invalidated, jealous, unhappy, right? It wasn't working out for him so well. And so she wanted it to continue because she had the sense that she was doing well and she believed in herself. He came out of it wanting her to stop, wanting her to not continue, in a sense. He certainly didn't seem to want to continue. Think about where that whole travel blog is now. I mean, continue making videos, right? The other thing that I think is really interesting, I want to come back to the police report in a moment, is if Brian did send those staged text messages, then Brian would have had access to her phone. And if Brian had access to her phone, didn't he have access to her phone anyway? And that he was actually, give me your phone. I want to read these messages that you send. I want to read the messages that you're getting, right? Possibly in terms of her Instagram. So if you think of it almost like she might make a comment, that someone, someone made a comment about what we did there. And, there's this crazy guy who said this. Show me. I want to see who this is. I want to show me who said that. Also, he may be communicating with the outside world via her phone. There are a lot of couples who share email addresses, sometimes share Facebook accounts, but the sense that I get is that he had access to her phone, and he may well have wanted to look at her phone to get an idea of what was really going on, and that may really have set him off. He may have realized, wow, this guy said this to her and she responded. This person said something and she responded, but we engaged, what's going on here, kind of thing. And that's not going to be good for him in terms of him being invested in what they're doing. there is a very successful Instagram channel called Camps Bay Girl, South African channel, which I think is also like this, on Instagram, where I think it's a couple, and the guy is the photographer and the manager in a way, and the girl is the model, and that does work. But I don't think that would have worked for Brian. So let's just go on here. So she says, she did not want to be separated from the male and began slapping him. He grabbed her face and pushed her back as she pressed upon him and the van. He tried to lock her out and succeeded, except for his driver's door. She opened that and forced her way over him and into the vehicle before it drove off. No one reported that the male struck the female. Both the male and female reported they are in love and engaged to be married. So it says here, no one reported that the male struck the female. So what's quite interesting is if you go back through the statement, he says, I believe, where is it? I believe it was reported that the male had been observed to have assaulted the female. So you have a contradiction in his own statement, right? So the first paragraph, I believe it was reported the male had been observed to have assaulted the female. And then lower down, no one reported that the male struck the female. Both the male and the female reported that they were in love and engaged to be married and desperately didn't wish to see anyone charged with a crime. Now, that's one thing that is going to de-escalate things, to say this is a statement of intent. We are actually in a serious relationship. We don't want to press charges and all that kind of thing. But that is also where the police need to use discernment. Now, this is where I think Dr. Matthias did quite a good analysis, and as I say, a link is to that analysis in the description, where he said grabbing, and I think she demonstrated in the latter part of the body cam, where she actually role-played, actually demonstrated how Brian put his hand on her jaw, kind of like this. Now, it's quite difficult to, something could have happened like that in passing. She may have tried to move across him on the car, and he was trying to stop her, and his hand just happened to be in that area. But I don't know whether to me, I think you need to go somewhere else. Okay, off you go. So, so he's not going to go for a walk and calm down, and then he's going to come back when it suits him. We'll see if that works. So, it actually says here, he grabbed her face and pushed her back. And I kind of get the idea that she climbed over him. He was trying to lock her out, and she climbed over him, and she actually, got his hand in her face. There's another creator out there that's put out a working theory on what she believes happened to Gabby. I didn't really watch the video, but I did see the title of a video, and I think she said that she thinks that he led her to the edge of a cliff and then pushed her. I think that's one scenario, but I think another scenario is this idea of a hand over here that can actually move over there. I think the other thing is you have the same scenario with Brian, who's an introvert, and Chris Watts is an introvert. And one of the impressions you get with both Brian and with Chris Watts, as well as their partners, is you kind of get the sense that they are intimidated and frightened by the emotions, the possible emotions, and the possible talking and communication that could result from these emotions. And so you kind of get the sense that they're trying to stop that from happening. They're trying to stop this person from expressing these emotions. And so what they're trying to do, and I mean, they've been trying to do it all along, they've been trying to restrict the shaping of possibility, right? Think about Chris Watts trying to stop the pregnancy from happening. He's trying to restrict the shaping of possibility. Think about Brian trying to stop the, not stop it, but he basically is undermining this whole project. He's restricting the shaping of, in a way that is like strangling something. It is holding it down. It is choking it, or you know what I'm trying to say is it's actually preventing something from breathing, from expanding. What's the opposite? What does that amount to? It amounts to that, and so that tends to be what I think is more likely here. I think it's more likely a similar scenario as what we saw with Chris Watts. Someone says here, innocent until proven guilty. That's absolutely true, and it was absolutely true in the Barry Morphew case, and it's absolutely true in the Summer Wells case, and it was true in the Chris Watts case. But I think you've also got to look at what we know when we deal with true crime and say, what is the fabric showing us, kind of thing, and what is it showing us, kind of thing. I don't agree with guilty by public opinion. I think it's important to look at the information and say, where does it lead? I don't think you should be simplistic and say innocent or guilty. Just in what direction is this taking us, kind of thing. Where does the information take us? So going back to this report, he grabbed her face and back as she pressed upon him and the van. He tried to lock her out and succeeded, except for his driver's door. She opened that and forced her way over him and into the vehicle before it drove off. Now, the impression I get is this happened that day, and I can imagine it being a very horrible experience if you, in a situation like that, you're on a road trip and you're being locked out of your own vehicle. It's kind of like a deal breaker. I mean, you're going to need something incredible where you're going to say, I'm sorry, let's try again, let's start over. And I don't think that happened. I don't think there was forgiveness. I don't think there was a proper resolution. I think the only way for there to have been a proper resolution would have been, if Gabby said, okay, I'm not going to continue with my blog, or we'll just take photos of cactuses or something, and she wasn't going to go that route. So it was kind of a deal breaker situation. No one reported that the male struck the female. Both the male and the female reported they were in love and engaged to be married, and desperately didn't wish to see anyone charged with a crime. Well, where do you think we are now? Do you think ultimately someone is going to be charged with a crime? They were desperately in love, but wasn't there also something else that was going on that was desperate? Was someone desperately jealous? Was someone desperately not? The words in the statement are desperately didn't wish to see anyone something. And isn't that maybe how Brian felt? He desperately didn't wish to see Gabby something happening with this person or that person, or seeing her in certain ways on social media. We know that he didn't want her to go line dancing. So what about other things that she wanted to do that he didn't want her to do? There were no significant injuries reported, and both agreed that Gabby suffers from serious anxiety. And this is where I think a little bit of a bias came in, where Gabby admits she suffers from anxiety, but, and maybe it's unfair to say this, but one thing that I thought when I heard that was, where's that anxiety coming from? Isn't that anxiety coming from Brian? And I think that is part of the answer, but I don't think the police thought about it that way somehow. I think they sort of thought she's got emotional problems. And then I think they then went into their own personal archive and saw, oh, this is something like that. And I think they were wrong. They were wrong to project it in that way. I've got to admit that when I was watching it and she spoke about her anxiety, I kind of took a step back and I sort of thought, is this a generational thing? You know, are millennials talking about anxiety? What is going on here? Is this got to do with coronavirus? And I think it does. I think a lot of people are suffering from anxiety because of coronavirus. It's dealing with jobs and love lives and lifestyles and choices. It's interfering with that, right? But the other thing is, when I was in high school and when I was in university, if I was in a situation like that, maybe it's a male-female thing, I don't know, but you know, can you imagine, say 20 years ago, a young woman, Gabby's age, in that situation saying, I think I'm suffering from anxiety, even if she was. All I'm saying is, I think it's become far more, the psychology is far more out there, and that everyone knows what you're talking about, including the police when you talk about it, right? And in a way it's normalized, but I don't think that necessarily means it's understood. What I'm trying to say is 20 years ago, if someone said, I'm suffering from anxiety, I think people would sort of laugh at you. I don't mean to suffer from anxiety is laughable. I'm saying to have said it like that in those situations would have been, sorry, what does that mean? Whereas here, you can kind of understand it for a couple of reasons. I think part of it is millennials are a bit different, and I don't mean that in a bad way. Coronavirus is something that is changing our psychologies. It's making everyone anxious. Where I went on holiday, the numbers, you know, at this place that I stayed have dropped precipitously. They get a lot of American tourists, and that has dried up completely. Those people are anxious. That the tourism industry is suffering from anxiety. So that's completely normal. But did they know how to interpret this? And so part of that anxiety is normal, but part of it isn't. Part of that anxiety is, you know, it's normal to be, let's say, traumatized or sensitized or feeling vulnerable. But there's another part of it that is unnecessary, where you can deal with anxiety and you can soothe someone and you can reassure them. And that part isn't natural. And so to be crying and to have the public calling someone to say, you know, this is going on, that's not normal anxiety. That's not her fault. That is kind of an unusual situation. Do you guys agree with that? Let's just look at your comments here. Rebecca says, I don't believe we will ever see Gabby again. And Brian, if we do see him, we'll never say a thing. Never is a long time. Pen Drift says, perhaps Brian convinced her that she had OCD by repeating that over and over. I agree, anxiety is more prevalent now. Also feel anxiety was brushed off by police. I think they took the anxiety almost to mean that she's very emotional and she's kind of irrational and she needs to calm down. And that's kind of what went on here. And thereby Brian is the good guy in the story. Brian's just trying to cope with an irrational person. Brian's trying to cope with an emotional person. And they're not actually seeing that there could be a rational cause for that anxiety beyond the normal stuff. There's another way of interpreting. So you might say the fact that these people are engaged and they don't want to press charges. Okay, we are off the hook as the cops. We don't need to worry about this. That's one way of interpreting it. The other way is to say, here's a guy who's got scratch marks on his face and had his hand on this person's mouth or jaw. How on earth can you say that? And she's actually in tears when they're talking. A member of the public's called. The police aren't going on yet. How on earth can you kind of say, you know what, it's not such a big deal. Okay, you guys carry on. Take the Chris Watts case. It's like saying, well, I'm married to this woman, don't really worry. And also she's pregnant, don't really worry. Well, that can make it 10 times worse. The fact that you're in a relationship and that things are supposed to be very secure, but something is happening that shouldn't be happening, right? It's actually showing that things are not working, coming apart, right? Catherine Hargrave says, Brian made sure to tell the cops that he too suffered from anxiety, trying to paint himself a victim. He claimed neither was diagnosed and neither took medication. I do think that in a situation like that, where you have both people saying, I've got anxiety, you're kind of going to have the police saying, whoa, I don't know what to do here. I don't know where to begin. These people are kind of freaking out and there's good reason to be freaked out. So, both people kind of claiming to be anxious is a bit disconcerting. It's like, where do I start? You know what I mean? Anyone in that situation, can you imagine just your neighbors, two people fighting, and you come into the scene and they both say, we're just so anxious. You'd be like, okay, well, I guess you guys will sort it out. Social media causes anxiety as well. Jacqueline D'Angelo says, sorry, Nick, from my observation as well as my 25-year-old sons, that generation all seem to suffer from something. We have raised a generation of children that are not equipped to cope or handle life. Sure, that's quite a tough one to... One thing I noticed in true crime is whenever crime is committed, someone wants to talk about autism or this disorder and they want to use this or that label. And I do think, and we're also in a society where the currency is outrage and indignation. And I think children learn from that, young people learn from that. I've got to be upset about something. There's got to be something wrong with something, whatever. But I also think we are living in a much more stressful society now than a long time ago. You've got this kind of weird combination of things are ridiculously convenient. Think about how much is on television and online and all the alternatives to be entertained and almost to be made lazy. And on the other hand, there are all these things that are different and more complicated, more challenging that we've got to deal with, that our generation, people who are alive now, have got to deal with, that wasn't really so pertinent 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. Something that is slowly becoming more and more and more stressful is climate change. It's like this, it's almost like a cancer that you think isn't there, but it just keeps getting worse. And you sort of feel like at some point we're going to have to deal with this. At some point it's going to deal with us in a way. But you don't really want to deal with it, but it's there. That's just one of many things that are part of the period we're going through right now. Thought Criminal says her crying is normal anxiety. My heart actually went out for a young woman to cry. If you see the opening scenes of Gabby with the police, she sort of bends over with her hands on her knees in a way. You kind of get the sense that she's trying to breathe, but just that she's willing to talk to the officer quite openly, quite honestly, and she's not like it's all his fault. she's trying. She's honest. She looks like a nice, good, sincere person. And if anything, I think she was trying to protect Brian. And I think it's something that she'd done before. And I think from Brian's side, I don't really get this feeling he was trying to protect her. I think he was trying to defend himself by being kind of apologetic, but by going from bristling resentment and anger to floppy, like being very apologetic. Like he did say he was sorry so many times. Lulu Nation says, I wish the police, rather than focusing on their anxiety, instead focused on their actual behaviors. That's a good point. That's a good point, because you can get lost in that, you're anxious, and that, where do you begin with that? Look at what actually happened. That is a really good point. The bottom line is that, as you say, he was calm and smiling while she was stressed and crying. That is the bottom line. And so who is the perpetrator? Who's, the other thing I don't know whether the police appreciated was that it was her van. That would be a good thing to find out, is why was Brian on this trip? Was he there to drive? Was he there for support? Was he there for company? Was this trip, instead of getting married, a sort of almost like a pre-honeymoon kind of thing? Why was he actually there? Did he insist on being there? What was his role? Blue-eyed Scorpio says his behavior by the cops is okay, but oh, Gabby, okay. For a free ride to California. Okay, so let's go back to this statement. And this is, the statement is 3 pages long. The middle page is the longest page, and that's the one dealing with kind of the anxiety. So he says, no one reported that the male struck the female. Both the male and the female reported they were in love and engaged. There were no significant injuries, and both agreed that Gabby suffers from serious anxiety. It appeared that this incident was more accurately categorized as a mental emotional health break than a domestic assault. Okay, so let me ask you whether you agree with that. So in hindsight, should that have been categorized as a mental health thing that happened, or a domestic thing that happened? Second word, assault. So let's get a vote on this. Put a 1 if you think it should have been categorized as a mental health break or mental health problem, and a 2 if you think it was a higher level than that. Put a 2 if you think it was a higher level than that. So most of you putting a 2. I did see a 1 there. Bear in mind, it is categorized here in the email just as disorderly conduct. It's not even. I suppose there isn't a category for mental health break. So I think the problem that we have in terms of true crime is, even in hindsight, if you look at the situation, let's say we were the judge and jury, let's say this was a preliminary hearing and we had to decide, is there probable cause that this was beyond a mental health break, right? Do you think that there was? I don't know. I would say that there was, given the scratch marks on his face, given the fact that she was in tears. Obviously, at the time, it would be hard to say because she hadn't disappeared at that point, but that is already quite a lot that is going on. I guess the biggest issue is that she doesn't want to press charges. Then he says, I had to leave, but I understand that Officer Robbins got the male lodging through Seekhaven. Gabby retained possession of the van and they agreed to separate for the night. No charges were filed and no one wished for charges to be filed or for the separation to take place. Although that was at minimum what Officer Robbins required in lieu of making a case against Gabby. So that's quite interesting, is that they were going to make a case against Gabby ultimately. It was going to be put on her. Gabby is a 22-year-old female who's approximately height and the weight, while her fiancé is older, taller, and much heavier than her. He had no fear for his safety and did not exhibit any indicators that he may be a victim of, quote, battered boyfriend syndrome. I think that's quite an important thing to make, is if you're going to say that Gabby was responsible for this assault, Brian didn't look like he was scared. Brian didn't look even angry. Brian was smiling and apologizing. And Brian was also the person who locked her out of her own vehicle. And Brian was the person saying, I don't believe in what she's doing, and dropped these little condescending remarks that the police didn't seem to catch or didn't seem to care about. I do think it's interesting that it ended up going on to Gabby, which I don't think is fair. And I think the analysis done by Dr. John Matthias, saying that he felt that the police were sexist, I think that I agree with that. I think that you had the one policeman saying, my wife did this and this and this, and almost having a chuckle with Brian. Well, look where we are now. I'm not saying it was an easy situation to handle, but I think the way that they handled it, he called it a little blog, yes. The way that they handled it, did that help or hinder what ultimately happened to Gabby? Did it embolden or what's the word? Did it embolden or did it scare off the person who did something to Gabby? Some people have said that, could Gabby have been pregnant? I don't know if I believe in that theory, although it does give you a sense that there could have been a lock-in. But the reason why I don't think it was a factor is, I think if she was pregnant, then I think Brian would have actually been happy, because I think Brian wanted them to get married and that would have sort of secured the deal. So, I don't really think of that as a factor. I think I don't really, I know people have speculated on that. I think it would have made Brian happier, and it probably would have also made Gabby not necessarily happier, but say, well, let's go home, right? Someone says, let me just deal with some of your comments. Well, these comments are coming through quite quickly. Damsel causing distress says she admitted to trying to punch him while doing 45 miles an hour down the road. How are you excusing this behavior? I think she's punching him because he shouldn't have been driving 45 miles per hour. So you might say that's dangerous that she's punching him, but he shouldn't be driving that speed anyway. And if you don't want someone to be driving your car, how do you get him to stop? It enhanced his feeling of control. Good point. Jacqueline says, keep in mind these analyses were not given on the spot. He scared her. She was afraid, yeah. Grandma Green, thanks a lot, Grandma Green. I've witnessed males in a rage, and when the cops came, the rage was gone and they were calm as hell. Absolutely. So I hate to say this, I hope it doesn't sound like victim blaming. It's not victim blaming at all. I just kind of wish that Gabby had sort of cast some shade onto Brian and just said, he scares me. Kind of the most that she said, and she said it kind of apologetically. Sharon, no, it's not in slow mode. I didn't think it would be necessary. But what the most that she said was that he's a downer. I don't know if you guys caught that she was saying that, he's, I think she spoke about herself possibly being in a bad mood, but him being a downer, almost like that he's been complaining and criticizing and things like that. Use your thumb to slow the chat. My thumb. I'm not quite sure what that means. The subs. Okay. Our thumbs, okay. So I must say, I found it pretty incredible that it starts off the way it does. And as I said, I think that the main question should have been asked by the police: how did the swerve into the curb happen? And I think the bottom line was that he wanted to keep driving. He wanted to escape the police, and she wanted to confront them. And in a way, that's the bottom line: is that she's doing the right thing. Or why does he not want to do the right thing, right? And it ends up being that she kind of takes the rap for this in a way. But in another sense, I do think that the police make a very good call, as they say, this is your vehicle, you take the vehicle, and you guys spend the night apart from one another. And it's unfortunate that they didn't learn, that this incident didn't lead to happily ever after, that they continued with their trip and everything went well. If anything, I think this trip probably got brought up again and again by Brian. What did you say to the cops now? And instead of what did you say on social media, now it's what did you say to the cops? Despite what happened, he probably would have brought it up again and again. He was assessed to be at low risk of danger or harm as a result of his proximity to his fiancée, and then nothing further. Okay, and then this is from Daniel Scott Robbins. So the first statement was from Eric Pratt. Basically, I guess the two statements, they're both about the same length. So he's got a slightly different story. So the one is dealing with, so this one provides the time in a bit more detail. So he says, I'm going to read this from beginning to end. On the 12th of August at about 4:45, 16 minutes to 5 in the afternoon, I responded to a possible domestic violence in progress call. A van with both a male and female as occupants was reported leaving the area of 39 East, 100 North, northbound on Main Street. One of the witnesses described the vehicle as a white Ford Transit van with a black ladder on the rear with Florida license plate QFTG03. Witness Christopher something reported seeing a male later identified as Brian Laundrie and a female later identified as Gabrielle Petito arguing over a phone. That's quite an important detail that the previous officer didn't give. So they're arguing over a phone. What do you think they were arguing about? Christopher stated that when Brian got into the van, he saw what appeared to him as Gabby hitting Brian in the arm and then climbing through the driver's window as if Brian had locked her out and she was trying to find a way in. So the impression I get from this is that the argument happened both outside the van and inside, and something like that where someone is running around the van and trying to get in, right, is going to, I think anyone witnessing that is going to be like, wow, that is quite bad, especially if it's the woman that is trying to get into what turns out to be her own vehicle. We don't know if there was screaming that took place when this happened, or shouting. Anyway, so he says, as if Brian had locked her out and she was trying to find a way in. I located a white van that matched the description on North Main Street at the Highway 128 turnoff. After I crossed the bridge, I was able to catch up to the van at the turnoff to Arches National Park. I confirmed the vehicle's license plate and initiated the stop. I followed the vehicle as it continued towards the entrance gate to Arches National Park. I noted the van traveling approximately 45 miles per hour in the 15 mile per hour speed zone. That's another thing that I didn't quite understand is if you take everything away, if you take all the anxiety away and everything away, Brian actually broke the law. You know, you're speeding way above the speed limit. And I don't know laws like in America, but, you know, when I drove in Australia, I think we were driving 92 in a 90 zone, and the police actually, the lights were on and you know, came up behind us and they were like, do you realize what you did, sir? And I wasn't driving, a friend of mine was driving, and he was like, no. He said, sir, you were driving at 92. This is kilometers per hour. 2 kilometers an hour above the actual limit. This is 30 kilometers an hour above the limit. And it seems like they just lost track of that. If Brian was ticketed for that, if he was kind of held responsible for that, let me just say that again. If Brian was ticketed, if he was held responsible for what he did there, driving in excess of the speed limit, is it possible that that sanction would have figured into what possibly happened to Gabby later on? Just something to consider. On the other hand, you can think that Brian got off quite nicely from that nasty incident that had been going on the whole day. You know, he ends up getting off on actually multiple things. And then doesn't he think, well, it's easy to get off. And he may have been listening to the coverage of the Summer Wells case. They left New York on July the 2nd. They didn't drive through Tennessee, but they bypassed Tennessee. They were quite close in that area. And it's possible that local news would have been covering it while they were in the area. Very possible. And the thing, you know, there's no person of interest. Nothing has happened. Oh, so if someone disappears, you can get away with it. I think it's quite an important thing to think about, that intertextual element. So he says, I followed the vehicle. It was going 45 miles per hour in a 15 mile per hour speed zone. After I activated my lights to initiate a traffic stop, I watched the van cross the double yellow dividing line in lane 1, merge to lane 2, and abruptly swerved to the right. I'm also not quite sure what he means by that. I don't know whether he means that did he cross into the left-hand side? In other words, was he going away from the direction that he eventually stopped, or was he going in that direction? In any event, it's quite a violent, unusual movement. If I was the narrator of this, I would have actually drawn a little schematic to show exactly what I'm talking about. I kind of want to see on a map where North Main Street was, where they were, and the entrance to Arches National Park, and just look at that distance. How far did the police actually pursue him? That's also not really mentioned yet. It doesn't say, you know, pursued them for 5 minutes or that distance. He says, I watched the van when the vehicle swerved, both the front and rear passenger side wheels hit the curb. When the vehicle swerved, both the front and rear passenger side wheels hit the curb. So both wheels on the passenger side actually hit the curb. So where you see the vehicle, it's actually jumped back. It's kind of bounced back. So it's kind of like a freak thing. And that's quite an extreme thing to happen. And I think they kind of blamed all of that on Gabby, right? I think they kind of blamed Gabby for causing that to happen. a short distance before the entrance gate, the vehicle came to a stop. So I kind of get the idea, it hit the curb and then went on a little bit of a distance away and then stopped there. He says, I approached the vehicle and saw the only occupants being Gabrielle and Brian. Gabrielle, who was in the passenger seat, was crying uncontrollably. I asked Gabrielle to get out of the vehicle to speak with me. Gabrielle told me that she suffers from redacted with redacted. She continued because of her redacted and redacted, combined with little arguments she and Brian, he says the word here, little arguments. I don't know if it's a little argument if this sort of thing is happening. Is this a little argument? She and Brian had been having that day, although I think she does say that they'd been arguing. I kind of get the feeling that they'd been arguing about small things for a long time. But I don't know if arguing about the blog and about that project is small. I don't know if I would say that. Gabriel stated that when she saw my light, she hit Brian in the arm to get his attention. So bear in mind that they'd just been struggling and fighting, and Brian was now effectively fleeing the scene, and she's trying to stop him from doing that. He's doing one thing and she's trying to have something else happen. I think if you really want to understand this, you kind of got to dramatize it, dramatize it kind of in real time to get a sense of really what happened. Maybe it will be eventually like in a Lifetime movie or something. She said, I asked Brian if I asked Gabrielle if her intention was to hurt Brian, and her response was that she did not intend to hurt him. I believe that, but rather get his attention. I don't think it was to get his attention. I think it was to force him, to exert pressure on him to do what he didn't want to do. I don't think she wanted to hurt him, but I do think she wanted to get him to do something. She said, rather get his attention to notice me as I was behind them with my lights on. At no point in my investigation did Gabrielle stop crying, breathing heavily, or compose a sentence without needing to wipe away tears, wipe her nose, or rub her knees with her hands. I think that's quite an important thing to stress there. If you're talking about little arguments and whatever, you might say, well, that's all down to anxiety. But it also could be down to something serious is going on, and didn't something serious happen? So he says at no point did she stop crying, at no point did she stop breathing heavily or compose a sentence without needing to wipe away tears. I kind of would disagree with that. I think she did stop crying. I think she was quite composed at a certain she was crying, but I think she was able to compose herself to some extent. But I think I would agree that she was very emotional and that what was happening was very serious. And you can think being locked out of a vehicle and then this whole police scenario and everything that's going on would be emotional. I don't know why one would blame her for being in that state. I suppose you can't expect the cops to be psychologists either. This guy, Dr. Matthias, is saying that at a certain point the cops act like life coaches to make themselves more approachable. And he says he doesn't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with that. I don't know if it was helpful for the one cop to be talking about his ex-wife. Use that time you've got to get the information from them. You don't need to talk about your personal experience. You can talk about understand and, like you can be a reassuring presence without giving your own spiel, like especially if it's a situation like that. Then he says, after I sat Gabrielle in the backseat car, I asked Brian to step out of the vehicle to speak with me. He told me they both suffer from anxiety, I guess, and although her anxiety is more advanced than his, issues between the two had been building over the last few days. So I think that's true. This in turn caused them to argue more than usual. That's probably also true. But how were they arguing? And what was happening? Him locking her out the vehicle. Brian told me neither he nor Gabrielle take medication for the anxiety. Brian explained he and Gabrielle had been traveling together for the last 4 or 5 months. That's not accurate. That actually maybe it is. They'd certainly not been traveling in that vehicle, I think, for 4 or 5 months. I think it had been, the road trip had really been going on for 1.5 months. I'm not quite sure how long it took them to drive to New York and what that involved, but not sure if that's an error. That time spent created emotional strain between them and increased the number of arguments. Makes sense. While arguing near Main Street, he had attempted to separate from her so they could both calm their emotions. But, locking her out of a vehicle, that's not going to do it. Did that make her more anxious? Obviously it did. He got into their van and Gabrielle had gone into a manic state. That seems a bit excessive. Wouldn't you have done the same thing? Try to get into your vehicle. Brian said Gabrielle pushed her way to avoid the slap. Brian pushed her away. Brian said Gabrielle, thinking he was going to leave her in MOAb without a ride, went to slap him. As Gabrielle started to swing, Brian pushed her away to avoid the slap. As a result, Gabrielle, off balance, but still caught Brian's face with some fingers, causing some minor visible scratches. Brian continued that when he had seen my lights, he thought Gabrielle had grabbed the wheel of the van and pulled it. Causing the van to hit the curb. So he's blaming Gabrielle for actually grabbing the wheel. I observed some small scratches to Brian's right arm, and when I asked him about them, he supposed they must have happened when Gabrielle was trying to get his attention about me being behind them with the lights on. This, however, was not consistent with Gabrielle's statement, further suggesting her confused and emotional state. What do you guys think of that? Was she confused and emotional, or is he deceiving her? What do you guys think? Bren says, I just feel Gabby deserved better protection-wise. Shimmer Soul, thanks a lot. After evaluating the totality of the circumstances, I do not believe the situation escalated to the level of a assault as much as that of a mental health crisis. I then determined, so I can understand the police taking the position they did, and I think some of their decisions were like separating them right in the beginning and having them spend the night separated. But there are one or two things that I disagree with. I think they should have chastised and punished Brian for speeding, right? He's actually fleeing the scene with a police car behind him. He's going beyond the speed limit. I don't know whether the police can do that, because I know sometimes that's the purview of the traffic authorities. The other thing is, I think that they should have, because they're quite young people, I think they should have had one or both of them call their parents and get that level of insight and understanding into what had just happened. Even though they probably wouldn't have wanted to do that, and nevertheless, I think that would have brought a sense of perspective and would have soothed the situation. Would have been unpleasant and would have been embarrassing, but it would have been something that I think the parents may have been able to soothe the situation, certainly for Gabby, right? The third thing that I think they could have done was listen to Gabby rather than judge her as the perpetrator. So I think although, whether they judged him the perpetrator or her the perpetrator, I think the result would have been the same. They wouldn't have pressed charges and they would have slept separately. But I think they made a mistake judging her to be the perpetrator, because if they did do that, then wouldn't Brian have taken a leaf out of their book and said, even the police blame you, this is all your fault? And Gabrielle may have also felt even more insecure after that whole scenario. So what I think ultimately happened with the MOAb incident was that both Brian and Gabby felt more insecure after what happened there, that they both felt less glued to one another in a relationship, and that their project was less viable. He probably felt less inclined to be involved in the project after that. I don't know how she felt. She may have just felt very upset and not knowing where to go from there in terms of the project. And that probably wasn't a very good place for her, because one thing she needed was a sense of self-belief. So just to end off, I then determined, he says, I then determined the most appropriate course of action would be to help separate the parties for the night so they could reset their mental states without interference from one another. And although they did express a desire to remain together, they both ultimately agreed to be separated until the following day. Accordingly, I wonder what happened when they were separated. Did they communicate in some way via phone? Did they communicate with anyone else at that point? And it is very unfortunate that Gabby didn't reach out to Rose Davis, her best friend. It's possible that if she did, she may have thought, if she did, Rose is going to tell her, I told you so. And she probably felt quite embarrassed by the whole thing, to be in that situation. Accordingly, I was able to contact Safe Haven and get Brian a hotel room for the night. I think the other officer referred to it as something else, Seek something. I instructed both and Gabrielle to take advantage of this time apart to relax their emotions and regain control of their anxiety. I also asked them to avoid contacting each other until the next morning, if at all possible. You might remember that the last thing that Gabby said was that Brian mustn't forget his charger. Well, more than likely that was so that they could communicate. If they had their phones with, who could prevent them from communicating? Gabrielle maintained possession of the van while I transported Brian to the hotel. They did both have their own cell phones in case of emergency. Around 7 o'clock, I went to, and that part's redacted, where witness Christopher, redacted, lived, and had him fill out a statement form. Christopher told me that he was not entirely sure what it is he had seen, but feared the worst, which is why he came forward as a witness and agreed to a complete written statement. Body camera video is available on evidence.com, and the statement from Christopher has been filed at the MOAb City Police Department. I'd actually like to see that statement from Christopher, but I do think that Christopher was absolutely right where he feared the worst, wasn't he? Christopher was right to be worried by what he saw. And it is, again, unfortunate where he says he's not entirely sure what he saw. Maybe when the officer went there, he said, well, she's the perpetrator. And then he was like, well, I'm not quite sure what I saw, but I feared the worst. Well, he was right to fear the worst. Does anyone know whether this Christopher guy is made any other statements? Has he come forward? Has he spoken to the media? Has he been on social media at all? Does anyone know? Christopher was a good citizen. He was. Sky, good to see you. Sarah Adams, it was a traffic stop. He stopped the car. He was going 30 over. Holographic Cat says these statistics don't take into account other factors like drug involvement, how much the parents cut into finding a mission person, and other news stories. Sarah Adams says most people have their cars towed on that offence. I must say my impression of this was almost that the police were very soft and understanding. They could have been a lot stricter, especially saying who was driving the vehicle, why were you driving this at speed, why is there all this ruckus taking place? Forget about the anxiety narrative, right? They were both instructed not to call or text each other until the morning, but Gabby was terrified. She was afraid because she didn't know where he would be and was afraid of being too far from him. That's from Lady Liberty. Donna Roberts says, I think the incident with the police made Brian more angry about Gabby. I also think he held it against her, possibly. I think it's possible that that incident may have felt like the last straw. You know, maybe what actually happened was that Gabby said, it's over. You know, I want to break up with you. You know, maybe he felt that way. Or maybe they tried to make it work afterwards and they just continued arguing. I do think things somehow escalated from that point onwards. So something that I want to talk to you guys about that I did mention earlier is traveling is an anxious process, right? When I went on my trip about 10 days ago, I was confronted with a flat tire. My car was still in the garage, it was packed, and I was confronted with a flat tire, and my immediate response was anxiety, because there were a few things I needed to do, and I was intending to leave fairly late, and I needed to get to my destination before the curfew. Now, because of coronavirus in the country where I am, the curfew's changed now from 10 p.m. to 11 p.m., but I wanted to be at my destination before the curfew. And because of the flat tire, I was in a dangerous position where I was possibly going to leave with a scenario where I might actually be violating the curfew, which I really didn't want to be in that situation. You know, you could theoretically be stopped on the road, your car impounded, and go to jail. And so the beginning of my trip was fraught with anxiety, right? Also, and this is just talking about when I left on my trip. The whole idea is I want to go on a trip and I'm looking forward to it, and it's going to be a nice break and sort of a fairy tale, right? It's the fantasy of travel, that I'm going to escape and it's going to be fun and it's going to be enjoyable. And so I'm taking my dog along, and you know, my dog has never been on a trip lasting not just 1 hour but several hours, one after the other. And I don't know how he's going to handle it. And he didn't handle it very well in the beginning, right? It wasn't fun. It wasn't fun for him because he doesn't want to be just standing, because he actually wouldn't even sit down. He was standing. And of course he can't look out the window, because he likes actually to poke his nose out the window and feel the smells going over his nose, right? You can't do that when you're traveling at the kind of the speed limit on the highway. And so he doesn't really have much to do. And how on earth do you... So all I'm trying to say is, in that situation, it's quite stressful. You're trying to go away on a trip. It was supposed to be my dog's first visit to the beach, and I did put a video of that on my channel a couple of days ago. What I'm trying to communicate is, you have this idea of what the travel is going to be like, and then when you actually go, there are all sorts of things that take place that are not fun, irritating, anxious, causing anxiety. And how do you deal with it? Baby Shark says Marlene Stewart, they gave him info. Kama Sutra, relationship things aren't always as it seems. The cops need more psych training. Started out as a simple traffic stop, but quickly turned. I thought the cops did quite well under the circumstances. I wish them better. I think they were dealt quite a difficult set of cards. I think it would be quite difficult to... I mean, ultimately, they separated them, and they separated them in terms of questioning them, and they separated them in terms of where they slept that night. And I think on that score, they passed. I think it's also difficult when the victim isn't blaming the perpetrator, when the victim is not willing to press charges. I think then that's difficult for the police to act. Do you guys agree? Kama Sutra says the cops are sympathetic to the guy. I think they were also sympathetic to Gabby, but it turned into sympathy for her to a sense that they were labeling her as mentally ill or labeling her as overly emotional. Where I think you've got to try and treat a person as a person, and that sometimes exactly how you're feeling is exactly the right way, is the way that anyone else in that situation would be feeling. And as soon as you try and label it, if your label is wrong, everything else is going to be wrong. And that's exactly what happened there. In general, if you had to say, do you think Gabby was suffering from mental illness? And it's a serious question. Do you think that Gabby going on this highly idealized thing, where I'm going to become a YouTube star, or I'm going to become a social media star or a content creator overnight, is kind of like a sign of mental illness, of having illusions, being deluded? I don't think it is. It's sort of going in that direction, but it's typical of a lot of young people. You have high hopes. You're supposed to be optimistic. You're supposed to take risks, right? You're supposed to do all those kind of things. So that element is part of the whole story, isn't it? The relevance of Fight Club, I think, is also really worth looking into. If you guys have time, try and watch the movie Fight Club. I've actually watched it probably the third time now. There are things I want to deal with. Even though I watched it the third time, I really didn't write down as many notes as I meant to, but I did write on a couple of quotes here. On a long enough timeline, the survival rate of everyone drops to zero. That's a quote from Fight Club. Now think about those words in relation to the timeline of this case. So you've had, on a long enough timeline, Gabby's disappeared, and now Brian's also disappeared. But just think about those words. What also happens in the movie, it's a movie about very dysfunctional people, but the functional aspect is almost held up as being cool, and that craziness is almost normal. And something that is asked in the last third of the movie, I won't spoil it for you if you haven't watched it, but the one character asks a woman, Marla, what do you get of it? Thinking that Marla is sleeping with Tyler Darden. And think about those words in the context of Gabby and Brian. What do you get out of it? What does Brian get out of this trip? What does Gabby get out of the trip? What are they getting out of the trip as a couple? Then there's another thing that I thought was really interesting that also comes up in the movie Fight Club. Fight Club comes up just as some of the reading material that Gabby was reading while this was happening. Why does a weaker person latch onto a stronger person? That comes up in the movie Fight Club. Now think about that question seriously. Why does a weaker person latch onto a stronger person? And I'll think about that question in terms of Gabby and Brian. Who is the weaker person? Thanks, Christine. Who is the weaker person in the story, would you say? So I would always say where crime happens, the weak person is the person who commits the crime, because of all the possible alternatives there are, in terms of your behavior, in terms of how to address a difference of opinion or a disagreement. A crime is something you do out of weakness, right? And so who do you think is the weaker person here? Even in the altercation that we've just done via the MOAb incident, who do you think was the weaker person? You might say Gabby. You might say she was physically weaker. She was emotionally weaker. Do you really think so? Who had a stronger social game? Who had a stronger sense of purpose? Who is the more determined person? Who is willing to confront or deal with authority, right? And so if you think about it from the other perspective and you say, and the other thing is you could say that Gabby was the weaker person. I don't think so, but if you take that argument, if she was stronger, she could have said to Brian, that's it. We've spent the night apart. I've thought about what is going on. You need to go home. I'm going to do the rest of this journey by myself or something. If she'd been stronger. Or Brian could have done the same thing. Brian could have said, you know what, I'm not enjoying this journey. I'm going home. Or that they both could have said, let's make the best of this. I'm not perfectly happy with this. And let's kind of make the most of it. But think about that again. Why does a weaker person latch onto a stronger person? Now, to me, when I hear that question, I think about Brian, who doesn't seem to have a lot of friends based on what Rose Davis said. Brian, who is still living with his parents. I mean, even on that score, Gabby isn't still living with her parents, right? Gabby got a job. Did Brian get a job? Why does a person latch onto that? Because they almost get a sense of being alive, a sense of status, a sense of belonging through the other person. That's also a very big theme in Fight Club, is that they latch onto these self-help groups to get a sense of meaning, because there's this one amazing quote in Fight Club where the guy says, nobody listens to you like people listen to you when they think you're dying. It's almost like you talk and all of it's meaningless. But when you add that element of a terminal illness or something, suddenly it becomes real and meaningful, and the conversations become real and meaningful, right? I seem to remember reading somewhere, I know when I was quite a young guy, I remember reading somewhere that a man shouldn't turn a woman into his adventure. The adventure needs to be the adventure, and you go on the adventure together. But you shouldn't turn the other person into the adventure. And I suppose it can work the other way as well, that a woman shouldn't look at a guy, perhaps a bad boy or a biker, and be like, well, I want adventure, so I'm going to be with this guy for adventure. The adventure should be something besides that person. You must invent the adventure. So someone says, Amory Cat Lady says that the book is excellent. Do you want to make any comments about the book? Have you read the book recently? What was your takeout from the book? How is the book different to the movie? How do you think maybe the book impacted on Gabby? What do you think she may have taken out? Because one of the things that comes through in the book is that mental illness the world is mentally ill, and that it's all very normal, and and it's not. I mean, Fight Club is in a way quite a sick film. Let's just see if Amory, we get another response from her. Mary Rose says he didn't leave her. Okay. I'm hoping we get some more feedback from Amory, who says she's read the book. Anyone else here read the book? Something I did ask today, I was at a barbecue and there were a couple of married folks with kids my age, and there were also kids of about, I think the oldest kid was 24 maybe, and I sort of asked, what is and I don't know if it's different in America, but I said, what is the average age that kids are getting married now? And I think they said like 29, 30. And I said, when I was, three of my best friends got married at 24. And I kind of thought that was a little bit young then. And so thinking that these kids are young, 23 and 22, what do you guys think? Do you think that they were too young? Is the average age, it certainly has gotten older over time because things have gotten more expensive and more difficult, right? But I think the other thing to consider is if you think about the viability of this trip in terms of starting a content creation scenario and compare that to the viability of their marriage. What do you guys think about that? Was the content creation viable? Could it have worked? Was it going to work? If they just continued if something didn't happen and they somehow got to the end of the road, they reached Portland, Oregon in October, which is still like, probably would amount to another 6 weeks of traveling from now. Would that have been a success? The way they were going, was it going to be a success? Was their marriage going to be a success? I think it's quite interesting to link the two. Has Amory said anything else? Pauline says, how would they have made it work when neither have jobs? That's a great point, because one of the key signs of maturity is that you work, your attitude to work. Making it work often depends on whether you have work and whether you can keep a job. Sharon Tuck says the frontal lobe of the brain is not fully formed until age 25. No way my daughter would go driving across America at 22. Tay Kelly says, I got married at 26, 30 now, and looking back, it was way too early. Okay. Thanks for that, Tay Kelly. Just Buggy says, it's all in how you are raised. My daughter's married at 19 and 20, and they are both still married over 20 years each. Well done. Good going. Bad Cactus, it would be anxiety producing to be locked out of your own vehicle. Absolutely. I mean, even if someone didn't lock you out your own vehicle, if you found your vehicle was locked, that's pretty going to cause anxiety, isn't it? Emery Cat Lady says, I'm reading it at the moment after seeing the film. I'm only 30 pages in. Okay. Any first impressions of the book, Emery? Ray MacGyver says, so men don't have anxiety and women have never been the aggressor. It's got a good point. But I do think, and sorry for saying this, but I do think generally that's true. Especially young men don't tend to have, in that scenario, driving. I mean, if Brian had anxiety, I just mean if Brian was like a nervous wreck, if you imagine like a geeky, really geeky, nerdy sort of dude, and then the police arrive, wouldn't he stop the car immediately if he was this nervous wreck? It's far more nerve-wracking to try and drive way over the speed limit trying to get away, most of the cases I cover in true crime, the woman is the victim and the male is the aggressor. A rare exception is Jodi Arias. So let me give you guys a little bit of perspective from my channel, especially if you're new to my channel. You might think that, because I think a lot of people get caught up in the dualism of true crime. Is it innocent or is it guilty? Is it right or is it wrong? Are you on Team Gabby's side or Team Brian's side? The position that True Crime Rocket Science takes is what happened. That's the position. What's reality? What really happened here? It's not on anyone's side. It's not on Team Gabby's side, and it's not on Team Brian's side. It's Team Truth. It's what happened, and invariably it tends to show that the victim isn't perfect, the victim isn't all good, and the perpetrator isn't all bad. Sorry to say, it shows us that we are all human beings. That even perpetrators are human beings. That they're not devils or demons. They are people just like us, and people just like us commit crimes. And you've got to try and have the discernment and the resilience to not act on certain impulses. But this idea that they are nothing like us and I'm on team this and I'm on team that, it's besides the point. People are people, and we need to be better at telling the difference between facts and fiction. Sarah Adams says, even in America, it's outside the norm. Sarah, can you take it off caps lock? Becky says, I agree, no one is perfect. We all have flaws. One of the problems with taking a position, so you say, that person's right, that one's wrong. That is good, that's evil, is instead of trying to get information, trying to have the scout mindset, trying to educate yourself, is that you then start to be defensive immediately. And there's a total difference between the attitude of, I kind of have a neutral position, I just want to know what happened here, to very quickly trying to defend a little bit that you know by attacking other people and defending your position and fortifying what you know and kind of digging yourself, entrenching yourself in a position, and then having that sort of endless dualistic arguments that you see in true crime. This channel doesn't take that position. What we try and do is find out what happened And when you know what happened very, very well, all the rest sort of sorts itself out. It's sort of self-evident. But what you do find is that you tend to sympathize with both people, hopefully. You sympathize and you say, wow, this was a horrible situation to be in. It almost feels like it was inevitable what happened, and try and learn from it. And obviously, a true crime channel is predicated on truth and justice. So obviously, based on that, you're not going to be on the side of the person committing the crime, obviously. But even so, you're also not going to take a position of you good and you evil, right? Having said that, I do have to say, in terms of the MOAb incident, I tend to take the position that Gabby already was the victim there. And I really feel sorry for her in that situation. I wish she had blamed him a little bit more. If she'd started by saying, he tried to lock me out of my own vehicle, something like that. He was speeding away. I mean, it's totally different. But I think she's quite a good person, to be honest. I think her goodness, because she was a good person, that enabled him to get away with certain things, I think. She blamed herself, yeah. And I also think something like saying, I have OCD. Listen to that psychologist, Dr. Matthias. OCD is a real condition. A lot of people say, I have OCD. I think I'm one of them, although I probably have very mild OCD. There's certain things I want a certain way. I wanted a video posted today out at a certain time. So I actually left the barbecue I was at to come home and posted it and went back home. You might say that's OCD, or it's a work, what do you call it? Someone who's just working all the time. But calling yourself by these disorders doesn't help either. Labeling yourself doesn't help either. In fact, I heard somewhere that if you're a smoker, or you're trying to lose weight, the language you use is so important if you're going to succeed or not. So if you say, I'm a smoker that's trying to quit, you're saying my identity is that I'm a smoker. You're labeling yourself a smoker. And so you actually need to take the position, I'm not actually a smoker. My identity is I'm not a smoker, and I am quitting smoking. The same with weight loss. I'm trying to lose weight. Or you could say, I'm actually a fit person in an unfit person's body, or I'm carrying a lot of excess weight that doesn't belong to me, and soon it won't. Instead of identifying, like where you say, I am fat, I'm trying to lose weight. No, I'm actually a fit person, the person who I am, I've always been fit. Well, get back to that. In other words, reclaim your identity. Don't let the label overtake who you are, otherwise it will overtake who you are, kind of thing. I wouldn't even say I'm a fat person in a thin body. I'm a fit person surrounded by fat. And, eventually the fat's just going to kind of fall off me because I'm moving all the time and just can't remain there anymore, So that makes sense. I'm just saying your self-talk is really important. I do think it is quite important to acknowledge anxiety. I think if you can do that, it helps you to deal with it. And I certainly find the anxiety narrative for this case absolutely fascinating, very sad, but I think something that we can all learn a lot out of. What else did I write down here? A lot of what Fight Club is about belonging, and I think a lot of the story between Gabby and Brian is about belonging. It's about them belonging together. It's about them finding their place in the world. It's about them establishing a niche in social media, and I guess failing, or one of them not being comfortable with that. But finding a place of belonging, being married, being engaged, is essentially about belonging to another person. And what's the opposite of belonging to someone? Well, it's being abandoned, being left behind, being alone, right? So we're almost at 2.5 hours. I don't really want to go all over the 2.5 hour mark. I do want to talk a little bit about Ernest Becker. He wrote the Pulitzer-winning book, The Denial of Death, and it's got a lot of really interesting application to this case, especially anxiety. So one of the things that he says is, we don't want to admit we are fundamentally dishonest about reality. Let me say that again. We don't want to admit that we are fundamentally dishonest about reality. Now, I'm going to bring that into the context of this case, Gabby and Brian. But before we do that, think about that statement. We don't want to admit we are fundamentally dishonest about reality. And think about so many things that are happening right now in the world. Fake news, coronavirus, do vaccines work? What should we do? How did the vaccines originate? Is the coronavirus really so bad? This and that and the next thing. The denial that has gone on for so long about climate change. And I might be saying those words and you might be like, this is crazy. Why are we even talking about it? We don't want to admit we are fundamentally dishonest about reality, right? And so, yeah, someone was asking, what am I talking about? I'm referring to this book. Okay, Ernest Becker, The Death, right? And now think about that regarding, like when I went on my trip today, I had a flat tire. I couldn't believe it. I thought, is it really a flat tire, or did someone just let the air out? Is it a puncture? And now apply it to Gabby and Brian. How realistic were they about getting married? How realistic was it going on a 4-month trip and doing the small amount of social media that they were doing? How realistic were they about each other? How realistic were they during the MOAb incident? How realistic were the cops about the MOAb incident? We don't want to admit we are fundamentally dishonest about reality. Now think about the MOAb incident, where we say, what happened here? What did happen there? We can say in hindsight that is possibly the precursor to something very, very serious that happened. And let's face it, the bottom line with the MOAb is, given where Gabby is right now, given where we are right now, was that a precursor to what happened? In other words, did Brian do something to Gabby during the MOAb incident, and then 10 days later, did Brian do something worse to Gabby? That's the question that's being asked. We don't know if he did. It's also possible that Gabby got really upset, said, just take my car, I'm going to hike. I'm going to go on a long hike or something like that. It's a possibility. Is it likely? I don't think it's very probable. Donna, can you turn off caps lock? We try not to have caps lock on here. Thanks, DJ Joker. So think about that also in your own life. We don't want to admit we are fundamentally dishonest about reality. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the reasons Becker goes into in terms of that. He also talks about something that I mentioned right in the beginning. Character is the restrictive shaping of possibility. And that applies to you as well. Your character is in part a, and not just yours, mine as well. It is in part a concession. It's in part a settlement, a transaction you make where you say, I'm going to take this role in society. This is going to be me. This is how I'm going to present myself. This is going to be what I do. I'm not really going to take this anymore. I'm not going to embarrass myself. I'm going to really take this position, right? character is the restrictive shaping of possibility. Now, if you think about as a writer, you write a character's role. You restrict that character to that role, right? And you can also write your own life. You can write your own story in the same way, but in the same way you can restrict it. So I can tell you, when I went on my little trip, I restricted the trip to that. I really wanted to make it about fitness. I wanted to make it about exercising at the coast and enjoying things with my dog. And it wasn't really much more than that. So I restricted it myself. And for that reason, I probably enjoyed it quite a lot. Whereas if I'd seen it as, I need to escape everything and come back completely refreshed, I don't know if it would have been as enjoyable, because that might be ill-defined, but harder to achieve. Something else I just want to bring up that I have meant to bring up, talking about bald guys. The way I understand it, I'm not a doctor, but the way I understand it, bald guys generally have more testosterone. It's one of the reasons the hair falls out is there's a sensitivity to testosterone, and because there's more in bald guys tend to have more testosterone. I don't know about you guys, but aren't more bald guys generally more aggressive than other guys, and sometimes also more emotional? Think about actors that are bald and the roles they play. Bruce Willis, Dwayne Johnson, Vin Diesel, right? Aren't they all kind of action heroes that are more aggressive than all the other men, right? And is that, I don't want to say sexist, is that a stereotype, or is there some truth to it? Also, are bald guys more emotional? And I kind of almost mean a bald guy who perhaps isn't an action hero, a bald guy who's a writer or a politician, or otherwise would have, or imagined he would have lots of girlfriends, but is for some reason frustrated in that, and he thinks it's because he's bald, and so he's more emotional than another dude, kind of thing. Quite interesting. I don't know if you know this. Vin Diesel's real name is Mark Sinclair. It's quite a difference, Mark Sinclair and Vin Diesel, right? Quite an interesting difference there. There are a couple of things I want to just mention in this book before I sign off. Timmy's just returned here. I've got here the characters, the restrictive shaping of possibility. I might do this in another live later on, but it's dealing with the creative solution with the problem of life, where you say, life is a problem, how do you deal with it? Like, how do you deal with finding meaning in your life? One of the ways is via the creative solution. Another way is, what was it? I think it's the romantic solution, where you find meaning in your life through a partner. And I kind of get the sense that Brian was finding meaning through the romantic solution, meaning through Gabby. And maybe Gabby started off that way. Timmy, are you licking my arm? I just don't know whether I want to be reading this right now at the end of such a long live. I know there's the romantic solution. I think there's another solution as well. Just can't actually find it. Anyway, I'll take you guys through the creative solution briefly. I'm quoting from The Denial of Death. And this guy, I don't know, I really admire him as a writer and as a cultural anthropologist. He won the Pulitzer Prize, and he says, the upshot of all this is that personal heroism through individuation is a very daring venture, precisely because it separates the person out of comfortable beyonds. It takes a strength and courage the average man doesn't have and couldn't even understand. The most terrifying burden of the creature is to be isolated, which is what happens in individuation. One separates himself out of the herd. In a way, I think that is what happened with Gabby, is that she was individuating in a creative way. She was individuating kind of on social media. And while that is sort of liberating and empowering and exciting for one person, it can be terrifying for somebody else. So the creative solution, think about people like Van Gogh who fully take on the creative enterprise. It can be a terrifying burden because it does mean you've got to go into that journey, you've got to be alone. You've got to go and figure things out in a certain way. I know about that loneliness as an author. But once you take that on, life becomes a lot easier and also a lot more meaningful. So he says, this move exposes the person to the sense of being completely crushed and annihilated because he sticks out so much, has to carry so much in himself. These are the risks when the person begins to fashion consciously and critically his own framework of heroic self-reference, right? What I've been trying to find, someone says, let's try and get to 500 likes. I don't think that'll be too hard. But when someone finds themselves in terms of art, the part that is very, when I say art, I'm just talking about the creative process. It could be anything in artistic way. It could be interior design. It could be YouTubing. It could be, just creating, constantly. That you are kind of at your own mercy. You can be your own worst enemy. You can get a lot of praise, but you can also lose it all, kind of thing. But in order to reach this point where you create, you've got to individuate. And think about if you're a 20-year-old, 22-year-old, 23-year-old, there are two individuations that are taking place. There's the individuation from peers and from society, the roles of society where you become a person on your own terms. So you individuate as a person. It's basically just a process of becoming mature, of asserting and establishing your identity. But if you take that and art, or the creative solution, or being creative, it means you've got to also assert yourself in that area. You've also got to develop an identity in that area, and that can be very difficult because you're trying to do both at the same time. That is what I think Brian found was too much for him, because I think it was hard enough for him to individuate. It was too much taking it into this creative enterprise. Or I suppose you could say if he was into the whole design thing, he needed to do it on his own terms. He needed to individuate his creativity his way, not through her, if that makes sense. To me, it's trying to get my attention. The key to the creative type, quoting from Becker, is that he's separated out of the common pool of shared meanings. Existence becomes a problem that needs an ideal answer. But when you no longer accept the collective solution to the problem of existence, you must fashion your own. The work of art is then the ideal answer of the creative type. There's so much more to say here. Timmy, come. Come, boy, come. Come, boy. So I'm going to kind of leave it at that. There's so much more to talk about from Becker, but I think if you this far in, it's quite late in the live stream. I do want to talk about where he talks about travel specifically as something that exposes our neurosis, and travel can be a horrible experience where you realize how uncertain and cruel and unfair and expensive life can be, where things go wrong. Your whole travel, have you ever been on a trip where everything goes wrong and the whole experience that's supposed to be magical and wonderful is a nightmare, right? That does happen, where everything seems to go wrong. Can you please share the name of this book? I want to read it. It's called The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker. Here's the book. I will try and, find where he talks about the travel aspect. He talks throughout this book about anxiety. So if you're someone suffering from anxiety, that book will really make you understand why anxiety is normal and also how to transcend it to some extent. The other thing, and again, I wish I had a bit more time, when he talks about the creative solution, you get a sense of what Gabby was going through, because she's trying to fashion an answer through her social media, through that content. She's trying to address a thing that we're all feeling right now, which is a sense of freedom and escapism, and that there's still beauty in the world despite the coronavirus, that there's still places to go to. There's still experiences to be had despite this feeling of a cage, right? And it's wonderful that there are people out there that are dreaming those dreams, that are still seeing the world as a place of vitality and life, And one of the reasons I have Timmy is I sort of felt like I'm finding this quite hard. I'm finding the pandemic and the lockdowns quite hard. I could normally tolerate loneliness quite well, and I sort of thought, I actually think I need a bit of help here, and that's why Timmy came along, right? And so Timmy's taught me to experience things in a simple doggy way, that you can smell things, you can go for a walk. You don't have to have very high standards to experience your doggy self. You can just, a dog wants to go for a walk every day and they just want to sniff what is out there. And I think that's something that's missing with us, is just seeing what is around us a little bit, right? You don't have to go halfway across America. You can go out your front door. You can walk around in the park. You can go drive down to the coast and spend a few days. It doesn't have to be 4 months. You don't need this perfect break. You can have a break that's just good enough, right? Alone is fantastic. Loneliness is hell. Okay. Okay, Timmy, I think I must put you down. Someone said they found her. I'm pretty sure that that's a prank, but let's just check. Search continues. I don't think they found her. Yeah, so I guess some pranksters up here. Mad About True Crime, another thought-provoking and insightful live with Nick and Timmy. Thank you. Thanks a lot, mods. Sky Kerrigan, thanks a lot for your moderating. Sharon, thanks very much. Brandy B says, okay. Fox News. What's on Fox News? Comfort pets are the best. They found her in what? Okay. Well, I don't see anything here about that. Let's try again. Well, I'm going to take that as not true, or if it is happening, it's happened 1 minute ago. Certainly not on my computer. Dorothy Peterson, thanks from Denmark. Marilise is found in Grand Teton. Yeah, no, search continues. I think let's end on that note with people saying that she's been found. Cheryl Brown, not identified. You should really provide the full amount of information. Guys, thanks a lot for being here. Thanks to those who provided super chats. Sharon, thanks very much for being here and for manning the fort, so to speak. Pauline Buckles, good to have you here. Yeah, no, that's different to saying that they actually found her. Totally different. Okay, I think I'm going to feed my dog some leftovers from the barbecue, and I hope to see you guys again. I'll probably talk about Gabby in that little opening window. So my impressions from the MOAb incident, the very first moments when you see her in an episode tomorrow, so look out for that. If you guys are interested in True Crime Rocket Science, we're a really good community on Patreon. You can join for $1 a month. So if you're interested in the coverage and the content there's a lot of content on a lot of other cases as well, audiobooks as well. Okay. Good night, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I'll see you guys next time. Ciao.